After her session with Lieutenant Commander Shida had ended, Dr. Nasushan used a tissue to wipe a bit of sweat away from her forehead. Then, she stretched her arms out with her fingers interlocked, loudly cracking her knuckles before bending her head from side to side to elicit cracks from her vertebrae as well. Then she rolled her chair a bit closer to her desktop and placed her hands on the keyboard. Quickly, she began to order and organize her notes in the session, bringing them into a cohesive structure and adding some comments wherever she felt necessary so she would remember her thoughts on the situation exactly when she would later come back to the file. Then, once she was sure that nothing that she thought to be important right now would slip her mind over time, she opened a new file and began writing down a formal report. Of course, the things that the Lieutenant Commander had specifically discussed with her were protected under doctor-patient privilege and wouldn't leave her mouth or her fingers without stated and written permission. However, as a therapist within the service of the UHSDF, it was still her duty to make a formal report about her thoughts and recommendations when it came to the future treatment of her patients, as the treatment obviously had to be coordinated with the rest of her patients' duties, especially with such a high-ranking one. And therefore she typed, "Extended care recommended. Regular sessions recommended. Reduction of duties not yet necessary. Exemption from service not necessary. Patient will remain under watch. Note: possible future recommendations could pertain to a change of place of service. Keep options open if possible." After reading it over a couple of times to make sure she hadn't made any dumb mistakes in her typing, she sent the report out to the leadership. With a sigh, she wiped some of her black hair out of her face and closed her eyes for a few moments. Then, after taking 5, she bent her neck again, cracking it one more time before getting right back to work. She leaned closer to the screen and looked at her schedule. Her next patient was... Admiral Creger's eyes flicked to the screen, showing her open inbox for just a moment, as she saw a message for her arrive. Although it wasn't what she was impatiently waiting for, her eyes still lit up slightly as she saw that the report on Cheetah's first therapy session had arrived. She didn't have time for it right now, but it would likely be interesting to look into it after she was done with her current task. Almost immediately, her eyes returned to the screen right in front of her, looking at it attentively. "I know that it's not really within our duties anymore, ma'am." The image of Coco broadcasted onto her screen said. The commander stood at attention, her hands folded behind her back. Her green eyes were staring into the camera with slight hesitance, but also carrying a background radiation of a vague hope that she might be able to swing something here. And it was appreciated. Coco's jovial optimism was often a source of delight. However, today, she knew she would stay firm, even as she was still listening to the request. "But the perp did ask for James specifically, so a visit might make him more amenable. And it's not like a brief conversation would cause any harm or damage, so I believe it is at least worth considering here." Admiral Creger sat straighter in her commander's seat and looked at the projection of her officer in a polite yet firm manner. "Your concern and request are acknowledged and appreciated, Commander Coink," she informed her, and gently tapped her wrist with an index finger, as one of her hands lay atop the other. "However, my decision has been made, and in this case it is final. There is no reason for you, Lieutenant Aldwin, or any of your teammates to talk to Mr. Berezi at this point in time. As the accompaniment for a candidate to the position of a councilman, your time will be much wiser spent connecting, preparing, and most importantly, relaxing a bit now that you have such a big task ahead of you. The galaxy is large, so you can't afford to waste any time with inanities. Use the time until your transport to lay back and get your heads into the game." As she finished speaking, she noticed a slightly unsure expression on Coco's face that spoke of the young woman not being quite sure how she would ultimately deliver that message. This, in turn, made the Admiral smirk, as she playfully but still noticeably firmly added, "And tell James that's an order." Coco's slightly distracted eyes snapped back to attention as her posture shot up a bit straighter. She tried to answer, quickly, but her voice immediately cracked and forced her to take a moment to clear her throat before she spoke again. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, and the involuntary moment of slowing down had given her voice the necessary crispness that the Admiral expected from such a reply. "Very good," Admiral Creger therefore said with a gentle smile, before her features returned to a neutral expression as she added, "You're dismissed." "Yes, ma'am," Coco repeated, before the connection was cut, and the screen that the commander's image had been projected onto returned to its usual neutral wallpaper. However, for Admiral Creger, the work was hardly done. Just because she wouldn't allow James to follow the lead that his one-time acquaintance offered, didn't mean that they were going to ignore it, after all. And with agents already on the scene, it was only a matter of time until a thorough report would hit the decks of many important people, hers being one of them. Until then, she had a ship to manage. Still, she did make sure to quickly check all of her inboxes before she returned to her duties, just in case someone had missed the fact that their report was supposed to be a priority. And as she did, she found herself reminded of the report that had arrived just earlier. She then figured she may as well look into it now, just in case it would be important. The agent picked at the seal around his neck as he entered back into his ship after a long morning spent on the station. This was his first assignment outside of human territories, and so he still very much wasn't used to constantly having the darn filter on his head. He could live with his head being encased, if he was honest. That wasn't the problem. But the darn itching of that seal was slowly driving him nuts. At least he could finally take it off now. With a hiss, the airtight fastening snapped open as he pressed the right areas on the helmet-like thing, and he pulled it off his head. His next customer would have to look him in the eyes as they answered his questions. Quickly he rushed to the closet bathroom in order to throw some cold water on his face, wipe away the sweat that inadvertently built up on his head under the less ventilated areas of the breath filter, and, most importantly, fix his hair that was entirely disheveled into a tousled helmet look. Once he looked halfway presentable again, he stared his own mirror image in the eyes for a moment, putting his game face on. A few times he inhaled quickly through his nose, and forcefully blew it out through narrow lips again, while his face hardened into a firm, stern expression. "You got this," he told himself with his look. "You got this." With one last forceful exhale that turned into a very subdued and admittedly pathetic war cry, he pushed himself away from the mirror and began to march straight out of the bathroom, down the hall, and into the sickbay that was holding their current guest. The two others had already been cleared by the doctors to be put into more permanent holding, but this one had just freshly woken up. As he walked in, his expression still stern, he immediately noticed that the entire room smelled freshly cleaned. He knew it likely wasn't done for his benefit, but at that moment he still very much appreciated the work of the medical and janitorial staff around here, because he sure as hell was more comfortable speaking to someone if said someone or said someone's room didn't currently carry the aftermath of a prolonged and very ugly fight for survival on it. Although he didn't allow his expression to soften in the slightest, the smell of Mars citrus and the sight of fresh white sheets did put his mind at ease a bit. "You're looking good, Master Chief Petty Officer Ortal Berezi," he greeted, and for a second he really wished that that rank wouldn't have been such a mouthful. Certainly had sounded a lot snappier in his head. The man in the sickbed had already been looking up at him as he entered, but now he was very carefully pushing himself up on his elbows. His overgrown mud-blonde hair was dishevelled, but clean, and the look in his light brown eyes was weak but clear and attentive. Once upon a time, the man must have been quite muscular by the look of him. However, right now he moved with all the grace of a newborn deer on a hardwood floor as he slowly sat up. "Former," he corrected with a croaky voice that hadn't been used in a long time, and just the small bit of energy it took to sit up and talk already seemed to wind him, as his breathing got a bit heavier between his words. "Who do I have the pleasure with?" Walking up to the bed, the agent held out a hand. "Special Agent Booker," he introduced himself, his other hand quickly flashing his badge at the man in the bed while he reached for the outstretched hand. Or tried to, anyway, because the movement of his arm was quickly stopped by the cuffs that tied him to the bed's sturdy frame. Bazi let out a mild groan as his arm was stopped, but then quickly looked up at the agent while wiggling the chain on his arm. "Right," Booker said, and reached out his other hand. This one was quickly shaken by the recovering captive, and the two men made quick eye contact. "Nice to meet you, Agent Booker," Bazi said between slightly laboured breaths, and he had to clear his throat every few words to keep his voice from completely breaking. "And your real name is?" "Classified," the agent replied quickly, as he pulled his hand back. "Figures," Bazi laughed, though his chuckle quickly broke out into a mild coughing fit for a few moments, before he caught himself again. What a condition to be in while facing reason again. Special Agent Booker looked sternly but politely at the man. "I'm not here to make your condition any worse," he assured the captured smuggler as he took up a tall posture next to his bed. "I just have a few questions. If you answer them quickly, I will leave you to your recovery." "Before I am shipped off to the closest prison that takes high-class Deathworlders, you mean?" Bazi countered with a raised eyebrow and knowing expression. "That's not up to me," Agent Booker quickly and briefly replied. "Yeah, I know," Bazi groaned, and pushed himself up a bit further with both hands. "And you're not the one I have to whine at to get a plea deal either." "Cooperating always reflects positively during the final judgment, Mr. Bazi," Booker advised. Bazi nodded. "All right. What do you need to know?" he then asked very directly, and his eyes had a serious and earnest look to them as they looked into Booker's. The special agent slightly lifted one eyebrow as he looked down at the perp. This in turn caused Bazi to chuckle, which again ended in mild coughing. "What?" the weaker man asked in between coughs. "Thought I'd make your life hard on you?" Booker firmed his expression up again and gave a sideways nod. "They usually do," he admitted. Bazi exhaled heavily through his nose. "Well, I'm not that kind of criminal," he said, in an exhausted but amused tone. "No matter what they tell you, there is no honor among thieves. And even if there was, I'm drawing the line at being shot and nearly biting it from an infection like some medieval peasant." He glanced up at the agent again. "What do you need to know?" Daxo Banker sat at the small desk in his quiet stockroom. The hurly-burly of the day had already passed, and the workers had already left for their homes. This was his favourite time of the day, the time when he got to sit down with his lists. He pushed his glasses up slightly as he took the large tablet into his hand, opening the long document filled with supplies, their numbers, their storage locations, and their destination should they have one. It was this quiet time when he could go over everything once again after he was no longer bothered by the other workers, always needing his input and direction, but before he would have to send his daily report to the higher-ups, that he appreciated the most. His only company was the gentle ticking of a clock on the wall as he sat at his small desk and slowly went over the list, scrolling it down at an even pace, while his eyes meticulously scanned over every row and line of neatly ordered text, comparing it to his orders, as well as the lists of the previous days, making sure that everything fit together and nothing was out of line. He had to be precise. Even the smallest discrepancy would earn him an investigation from the higher-ups, should he approve a faulty list or send out a faulty report after all. For a moment, his eyebrows furrowed as he felt like he heard steps in front of his door. Likely some soldiers mucking about the storages in search of something like blind birds madly pecking at unseen seeds that they knew had to be somewhere on the ground. Banker sighed. Couldn't they at least do that quietly? Oh well, it was none of his concern, he thought, as he lowered his eyes back onto his lists. Then suddenly, the door to his stockroom flew open forcefully with a bang, and before he even had the time to fully look at the loud disturbance and outrage, people were already flooding into his peaceful ideal. Uniformed people, many of them, at least a dozen, and they all marched into the stockroom like they owned the place. Almost all of them were masked with simple breath filters. However, the last man to enter the stockroom after everyone else had already flooded in had his face uncovered. Putting a black leather glove tightly over his hand, he loudly spoke into the room as the others started to swarm the place, opening boxes and disheveling shelves like looting brigands. "Alright, people, I want this done quick. I want this done clean. I want every sock, every button, every kernel of dust that is out of place filed and reported. Do you understand?" he loudly ordered everyone else. He didn't get a reply, but the faceless people in uniform that had invaded Banker's space here seemed to follow a mindless, drone-like determination as they spread throughout the entire storeroom and began to tear Banker's precious order apart. One of them even approached Banker himself, and quickly, they reached out to simply take the tablet that held his precious lists out of his hand, without saying a word about it. He tried to pull away, but the person was faster, and with a surprisingly firm yank, they suddenly held the tablet in hand. "Hey!" Banker tried to protest, as he quickly stood up, bursting forward to try and conquer his prized possession back from their brutal hands. "You can't—" However, before he had even reached them, a firm hand was grabbing him by his shoulder and pulled him around with unyielding force. As he glanced down at the hand that held him, he could see the black leather glove. "Mr. Banker," the same voice that had given the orders earlier firmly greeted him, and Banker forced himself to look up at the man's face. The brute had short salt and pepper hair, and a patchy beard of the same colour. Dark eyes stared into Banker's own, as the hand held onto his shoulder like a fine vice. "I assure you, we can." From his pocket he produced a folded paper document. Banker's skin crumpled into goosebumps as he saw the creases and wrinkles that the paper was carelessly punished with after being heedlessly stored in a pocket. Despite still being held by his shoulder, he quickly took the paper out of the brute's hand and began to read it. "My name is Special Agent Gumshoe," the man introduced himself, as his arm relentlessly gripped Banker's shoulder, and the lord of the storeroom could feel the blood slowly begin to freeze in his veins as his eyes took in the sight of a signed, near-absolute search warrant. "I am with reason, and I have a couple of questions for you." Dr. Soman's steps echoed slightly in the carpeted hall as she quickly crossed it with two hot, in fact very hot, cups of to-go coffee in her hands. Though she had been quite sure that she would be able to bring them back no problem while she was still standing in front of the machine, that decision had turned out to be a rather stupid one about halfway back to her office, and now she had to hurry if she didn't want to drop the hot beverages, because she absolutely refused to admit defeat and put them down onto the ground, like the idiot she was, to give her hands a much-needed moment of reprieve. No. Even if her hands would be cooked medium rare, she was determined to make it back to her office without taking a break. Her steps got smaller and faster with each second that she walked, and towards the end it almost looked like she was speed-shuffling towards the door, that luckily opened for her presence automatically, as she quickly hurried inside, nearly stumbling and falling on her face as she quickly dashed to set the hot cups down onto the desk. "Made it," she thought to herself with a relieved sigh. However, her triumph only lasted so long until she noticed that her colleague, Dr. Nori, was looking at her with a curiously raised eyebrow, likely after watching her mad dash to the finish. Dr. Soman quickly cleared her throat and stopped leaning on the desk she had nearly fallen against. As she stood up straight, she quickly straightened out her long jacket with a couple of quick, gliding strokes. "I, brought us coffee," she informed her colleague, to which the man quickly nodded. "I can see that," he replied, and grabbed one of the two cups, pulling it over to him as his eyes returned to the computer screen in front of him with deep focus. Intrigued by that, Dr. Sorman walked up to his side and also leaned down to look at the screen. "That's the data?" she asked, as her eyes landed on the masses and masses of files that the computer was currently sifting through on their behalf. "Wow, there's a lot of it." She lifted her own cup and took a quick sip of the hot liquid inside while her colleague nodded. "Yup," he confirmed briefly. "Just came in, and as expected, it got treated to a top priority." Dr. Sorman hummed, after taking another sip of her coffee. After swallowing, she quickly needed to take a few panting breaths to cool down her mouth and throat before she could actually get her thoughts out. "So we think it's our guy?" Dr. Nori released a hoarse chuckle and shook his head as he leaned back, waiting for the computer to process the data with whatever algorithm he was currently running it through. No, he said quickly and chuckled again. "Not by a long shot, but he doesn't have to be. Higher-ups are hoping that this might show us where the cracks could be that our actual guy is slipping through. Apparently this runs pretty deep." Dr. Sorman made a dissatisfied sound before sighing. "Pretty annoying to think that despite all those precautions, someone's still always able to worm their way through. Almost disheartening," she mumbled. Dr. Nori stretched his arms up for a moment and groaned in some relaxation. "Well, at least we might have them now," he said, ever the optimist. Then he glanced over at her with a mild smirk as he added, "Besides, if we weren't planning to get hit, then why wear armor?" She cut him off by finishing the sentence for him. Yeah, I know. Nothing's ever perfect." "Exactly," Dr. Nori agreed with a snap of his fingers. Then he looked at the screen again, where a progress bar slowly crept its way up in increments of tenths of a percentage at a time. With a playful scoff, he added, "But you know what would make this easier? If we had that realized helping out." Dr. Sorman had just taken another sip from her coffee, and now had to try really hard to keep it in instead of spitting the hot liquid all over the computer. Swallowing heavily, she glared at her colleague. "And be strung up in the streets for giving something like that access into our most secure systems?" she asked facetiously, with her eyebrows raised, before shaking her head slowly and continuing her drink, mumbling into the cup. "No thanks. I'll take the slow loading speed." Dr. Nori laughed again. "Well, in that case, you're handing in the progress report today," he said, and nudged her shoulder with the back of his hand. "Because at this rate, this is going to take a while." Admiral Creger read over the report she had received, with slightly furrowed brows. Seemed like cybersecurity would need some more time to really comb through everything, now that they had a lead. It had been only a day since she had given the order to raid the storeroom that the captive veteran had pointed them towards. So although she was impatient and would have loved to get everything sorted immediately, she was overall satisfied with the progress they were making. It had always been clear that the issue would have to run deeper than just someone fudging a few supply lists. Even if one had control over the crates itself, there was no smuggling anything out without really getting into the systems, even if they were just low security items. After all, a crate disappearing from the lists would have to have been confirmed to have arrived somewhere if it wasn't reported missing. And if someone was getting into the system for one security leak, who was to say that they weren't getting into them for more than that? Especially since she doubted that whatever little pocket money there was to be made by selling off some surplus supplies was worth the risk in the end. No, something bigger was going on, and hopefully that something would lead them into the right direction to figure out how exactly their communications and/or data had been compromised. Where there was one leak, there may have been another, after all. And even if there wasn't, at least this was one enormous security risk terminated in the short run, even if it would not offer the lead they were hoping for. If she ever got the chance, she should thank Alexander personally for pointing them in the direction of the corrosion within their own ranks. Not that he'd be able to appreciate those thanks for very long, should they ever meet face to face. But even though she'd have liked for those questions to be answered right then and there was nothing to be done for her. If they needed more time, they needed more time. Still, she quickly got to work writing up a direct order for both a short and a long-distance squadron to be on standby, and be ready to move out as soon as results were in if necessary. The more time they would use to prepare, the better. She wanted them ready to jump as soon as that starting gun was fired. As soon as she had written and sent out the formal order, her attention was already pulled in another direction, as it seemed like the ship was ready and waiting to transport James and his team by now. However, it seemed like there was still one problem holding things up. Dr. Genevieve Duarte tapped the touchpad pen of her tablet onto the plate of her desk rhythmically, as her eyes slowly glided over the case file of Caffifrone versus Caffifrone, a case that may have established precedent 2 uniform years ago, which stated that self-mutilation, if done under no duress and in full possession of one's mental abilities, would not be ground to deem a person to be less mentally stable. Admittedly, the plaintiff here was basing their case on religious reasons instead of personal ones, and the self-mutilation in the case came down to the carving of their own horns into a new shape, instead of full body modifications, so the comparison may have been a little bit of a reach. But in the end, precedent was precedent. The only thing they had to do was convincingly argue that point. The only issue was that the opposition may argue that Curie would not be in full possession of their mental abilities. Method was a condition that at least somewhat influenced one's mental capacities, after all. In human courts of law, that influence would have by far not been enough to argue that Curie was in need of a conservatorship or guardianship. However, in the end, it was all a matter of argument. She needed to be able to convince whatever judge would be hearing them that Curie was perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, and fully aware of and happy with the things they had done to their own body. And that would be an uphill battle. The chances of winning the lottery here, and getting a galactic judge that somehow had no prejudice whatsoever against body modifications, was probably close to 0. Therefore, they would have to make an airtight case. Anyway, this case here was a good start at least. Exhaling briefly through narrow lips, Dr. Duarte then reached over to her phone. Using speed dial, she immediately made a connection to her paralegal. "Hey, Adeline," she greeted her, as soon as the younger woman had picked up the call. "Anything new on your scouring of the Terraveld networks for cases establishing precedent on the issue of the mental effects of MEPIP on the cognitive independence?" Adeline's voice hummed on the other end of the call for a moment. "Well, we found a few that look promising, although there's still plenty to sift through," she replied, after a few clicks could be heard. "The algorithm is having some trouble with the translation software, and many cases aren't filed in GU, so it's all taken a bit longer than usual, but we're hard at work. Would you like me to already send you a list of the most promising cases we found so far?" "Please, and thank you," Dr. Duarte replied with a gentle smile on her lips, a sigh escaping her. "Already done," Adeline replied with a chuckle, before hanging up the call. Once she looked into the message, Dr. Duarte quickly began reading artificially generated summaries of the different case files that had been sent to her, and once she had picked out the most promising ones, she opened them and began skimming over the many pages of legal documents involved. What she found wasn't especially great, but at least it was somewhat comforting. It seemed that MEPIP was indeed generally seen as a hindrance to one's cognitive abilities, especially when it came to issues of a complex social nature. However, although that was the case, one thing that stood out was that in all the cases where either the plaintiff or the defendant or respondent had the condition, there appeared to be no mention for a legal guardian in any of the filings. Clearly, MEPIP alone was not seen as a solely sufficient reason for a guardianship, even within the Terraveld territories. Otherwise, she would have to have found at least some cases in which the afflicted people were not allowed to legally represent themselves. Not necessarily a breakthrough, but certainly a step in the right direction. While she was currently skimming through the third case, her phone began to buzz. She quickly glanced down at it and, recognizing the number of her legal assistant, quickly picked up without her usual fanfare. "Hey, Holly, where's the fire?" she asked, pinching her phone in between her chin and shoulder as she continued reading the case. "Hello, Doctor," Holly quickly replied. "I'm just calling to let you know that a date has been announced for the hearing of our discovery motion against the parents." Although there was a rather standard thing to happen, admittedly, Dr. Duarte's heart still always beat a bit heavier whenever she heard that a future trial or hearing was getting a specific date, even after so many years of being an experienced lawyer. Fighting down the silly nervousness trying to take hold of her limbs and voice, she professionally replied, "Great. Does it conflict with any other appointments?" "No, everything's already planned out and penciled in your calendar," Holly quickly informed her with a chipper voice. "You're a treasure," Dr. Duarte replied, with yet another relieved exhale. "Do you need me to help with anything before the date rolls around?" Holly then asked in return, seemingly eager for some action other than planning. Dr. Duarte exhaled through her nose with a smile, and wiped some hair out of her face before continuing the tapping with her pen. "Well, we need to make our case as solid as possible that we really need deep insight into their communication histories, especially during the weeks leading up to their motion for guardianship. The timing of them trying to gain legal custody and the alleged patent infringement on Nadie Rowe's side is still too suspicious for my taste," she explained with furrowing eyebrows. "If you've got the time and are willing to go, feel free to help out on that front." "All right," Holly quickly replied with enthusiasm, though then she quickly chimed in with, "Oh, before I do that, should I give the client a case update?" Dr. Duarte looked up slightly at that question. "Yes, please do," she confirmed. "Let's keep them in the loop as much as possible. They're in a precarious situation after all." "Will do," Holly replied. "See you later for lunch?" "Definitely," Dr. Duarte replied before hanging up. "Tell Adeline it's on me today." As Curie was on the phone, they were slightly irritated by the constant tapping of James's foot that they heard nearby. "And would you like me to be present for that hearing?" they asked candidly into the phone, while doing their best to ignore the mild noise their anxious friend made. Ever since he had officially been ordered to relax, he had begun spending a lot of time around them, especially when Sheeda was either asleep or busy. They generally didn't mind. They enjoyed his company. However, currently, he was often so nervous and stressed because of their situation, and his willingness but inability to do anything about it, and they didn't like seeing him like that. "No, that would not be necessary," Miss Huddleston replied politely, with a slightly nurturing tone. "It's not really something the client's presence helps with. As your legal representatives, we will make sure to do our darndest to get that motion granted." Curie nodded their mechanical body, although it was more for their own benefit than that of the conversation partner. "Very well," they replied. "Is there anything else you require of me?" There was a brief pause. Then the legal assistant seemed to have a thought that she quickly gave voice to. "Actually, while I have you here," they said, in a way that sounded thoughtful and pondering, "it will come out during discovery anyway, but would you happen to know the name of the doctor that diagnosed you with MEPIP back in the day?" Curie thought for a moment. "That was right after my birth. I am not directly aware of the name, but I am sure I have that information saved somewhere. Would it be enough if I sent it to you a bit later?" they asked, hoping that would not be too late. Miss Huddleston laughed. "Of course," she said joyfully. "That will be more than enough. Thank you for humouring me." "No problem at all," Curie confirmed for her. "Anything else?" "No, that should be it," Miss Huddleston quickly replied. "But also feel free to let us know if anything comes up, or to simply call for an update, all right?" "Understood," Curie replied with a hint of happiness. They really enjoyed Miss Huddleston's pleasant courteousness. "Thank you for always keeping me up to date." "That's my job," Miss Huddleston replied quickly. "All right then, we will hear from each other. Be well." "Be well," Curie replied. Once the call was hung up, Curie turned towards James, who was still bouncing his leg. "Have you packed yet?" they asked him directly. making him look up at them, seemingly snapped out of deep thought. "Have you?" James immediately asked back, although Curie could see it on his face that he instantly regretted the aggressive nature of his reply. "I'm not going," Curie explained. "At least, not right now." James inhaled deeply and brought his hand down onto his leg to stop it from bouncing. "Well, then he tried to say. However, Curie interrupted him. "There is no point in you staying," they said. "You have more important things to do." James's face fell a bit flat. "More important than helping a friend?" he asked. Curie shook their body and walked a few steps closer to James, with one of their large backwards legs reaching out to him. He didn't flinch, as the hard metal made gentle contact with his shoulder. "You are helping me, James," they said. They had thought about this for a bit in the time that they and James had both been busy, and now it was the time to say it. "I am in this situation because of the very things that you are currently putting yourself out there to fight. I am perfectly safe and taken care of, because I have many amazing people looking out for me. But I know many others in my position may not be as lucky. I had to admit to myself that I could not take care of this myself, and I believe those many others would not be able to either." They looked directly at James. They knew it was less effective because of the vacancy of their mechanical eyes, but they still hoped the gesture would get across all the same. "I am incredibly lucky, James," they said. "Incredibly lucky to have such amazing friends that want to support me, that accept me for who I am, but so many, many others out there are not as lucky as me. For a long time, I wasn't either, so I know how it feels. Being alone in a world that just doesn't want to understand you." Curie lifted a second one of their legs, wrapping them around James and pulling him in a bit. Then, they reached out with one of their tiny forward arms, taking his mechanical hand into theirs. "You are a great friend, James," they said earnestly, as they held onto his hand. "You have helped me so much, from the very moment we've met and ever since." They looked at him, making sure he was looking into their eyes before they continued. "I don't need my friend right now," they said. "I am well taken care of, and I can also take care of myself a lot better than I once could. But those others out there, all the ones that didn't have a James, who never got pulled out of the fire, they do. They desperately need friends, friends that see them, that want to understand them, friends who make sure that what's happening to me doesn't happen to those who cannot defend themselves. Do you understand?" James released a reflexive breath before fighting it back down. His face darkened for a moment, but his lips curled into an unwilling smile. Yeah, I get it," he said, and his strong mechanical hand began to clutch Curie's tightly. They didn't mind. "I'll try to catch up to you," Curie then continued. "But I'll be honest, I don't know if that's going to work. With what I've had to do to get here, and with what they've invested to stop me, I won't be let go easily. That doesn't mean that I won't try. However, even if I don't make it, I'll be alright, because I know you've got my back." James snapped up at those familiar words. His eyes lit up in recognition. Of course he recognized them. They were his own. He had said them to Shida. Back then, he had been beaten, bruised and abused after going through hell and back to get her and Curie and the others off the GCS, while he stayed behind. Back then, he asked them to trust him that he'd be alright. Now Curie was doing the same with him. Another involuntary exhale escaped James's lips, and he wasn't quite able to fight it back this time. In the corner of his eye, Curie could see a single tear glisten. "Come on," he mumbled under his breath, and he wiped it away with his finger. Then, James burst forward and wrapped his arms around them tightly. "You better still have all your arms the next time I see you," he mumbled, as he had his arms wrapped around them tightly, not caring at all about the hard rigidness of their exterior. Despite his clear sadness, a gentle smile was on his lips. Curie's large legs closed around him to hold on for a moment. They weren't really one for hugs, but they knew he needed it right now. and also knowing that he often appreciated humor in moments like this, they replied, "Who knows? Maybe I'll have more."